Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Commercial Awareness Compass, your weekly guide to developing commercial insight that goes beyond just the headlines. Each week, we take one major story and break it down to help you progress through three levels: beginner, intermediate, and advanced commercial awareness. Whether you're just starting out or already have some understanding, this program is here to help you think like a commercial lawyer. By the end of today's session, you'll have practical insights that you can use in applications and interviews. Today, we're diving into the world of stadium sponsorships and naming rights, a topic that combines law, business, and sport. With Everton's new stadium recently announced as the Hill Dickinson Stadium, we'll look at the companies that invest millions into have their names on stadiums and what legal and commercial work goes on behind the scenes. So my name is Daniel Shepherd, and I'm a law conversion student and a future trainee solicitor. And today I'm joined by Emma, a solicitor with extensive experience in commercial and contract law. She'll help us explore today's legal and business topic, offering insight into how lawyers tackle complex sponsorship and naming right deals. So welcome, Emma. How are we doing today?
Hi, Dan. Thank you very much. I'm good. Tar, how are you doing?
Yeah, doing good. It'd be an interesting one to get into. So to start off with our beginner section, could you give us a simple overview of what naming rights are and why they matter?
Of course, I can. So, in particular, relating to stadiums, maybe they're commercial agreements in which a company would pay a fee to have its name associated with a stadium, a sports arena, or even an entertainment venue. We don't have to whittle it down to sports, but I think that's what we'll focus on today with the latest news. It's a form of sponsorship and advertising. So, that's another way of thinking about it if you wanted a little step back from maybe thinking about the contracts or the agreement side. It's just a form of advertising and being able to sponsor something. And a naming rights deal does give a company the legal right to name a stadium or one of the above that we've just mentioned for a specified period of time and under certain terms, of which we will get into during the session today.
So why do businesses sponsor stadiums and kind of what's in it for them?
Good question, because it costs them a lot of money. So there must be a lot in it for them, because some of the amounts of money that we see bandied around just to put your name on top of something, there's got to be something in it for the sponsor, right? So if you think about advertising, which is the basics that we've just drawn this down to, advertising is expensive, but it's because it's lucrative. Getting your brand out there and awareness in the right way can have huge benefits. So that's one of the main reasons why a business would sponsor a stadium, because it helps them to link a different industry to theirs in enhancing their market reach in a way that a competitor couldn't, because who would really associate, let's say, an airline with a football team before now, but it's pretty well entrenched. Now we have certain stadiums using certain names. So you get that brand visibility and huge brand exposure. You can put yourself ahead of the competition as part of their strategy. It's almost like a pride thing as well, like an association with a community or a sense of pride. If you can establish that link, a true, great, brilliant marketer will be able to do that and sell it in that way. And then, of course, you've got customer engagement opportunities. So if you are a big fan of one of the stadiums or the entertainment venues or something that the sponsor is sponsoring because they've got their name above it, then you might think, oh, by flying Emirates, I'm supporting this team, for example. So you've got that link, and it does enhance the engagement opportunities for customers too.
And on like the other side of that, why do stadiums or sports club accept these sorts of sponsors, and how does it benefit them financially or otherwise?
Money makes the world go round, so we can't not answer that, as you've just alluded to with the financials. But why do they need that money, I guess, is the follow-up question. So it's a really good revenue stream to fund the construction. We have discussed in previous sessions, we spoke about the new United Stadium and how much money is that going to cost with the construction. So perhaps, with Everton finding Hill Dickinson, that money will be used to fund some of the, I know it's majorly built now and it's up and running, but they might have debts to pay off. They might have factored in sponsorship to the business plan to mean that they can actually afford the construction or the maintenance or the operation. They've got a huge payroll to pay for. The bigger the place, the more people you're going to need to maintain it. You've also got enhanced financial stability. So if you can show on your books every year for so many years that you've got a contractual allowance, this money for a sponsor, it's going to help with your profitability and your balance sheets and how your accounts look and everything like that. And then if you think about the reason why we're here today talking about commercial awareness, we know that businesses need money, and whether it's the law firm or someone else, money to continue. It really does help with that foresight of running a business. And then obviously wider opportunities with the sponsor itself. There's a lot of information that we won't be privy to through these agreements, but who knows, there might be private jets awarded, there might be special legal services awarded, there might be certain credit cards that you get certain benefits with, all subject to regulatory things, of course, which we'll get onto, but as a result of these deals. So it's both ways, it's beneficial, both sides, if you can get it right. And that's, I guess, what we'll get onto, Dan, is the getting it right part.
And before we go into the next level, what are some of the key terms that we should know when looking at these sorts of agreements?
Oh gosh, thinking about the agreement. So we're into commercial law now, so a commercial agreement. You've got term, which I think, I don't want to be patronising when I mention this, but I've mentioned term before, and the term is essentially just the duration or the length of an agreement, and it doesn't really, it's not really self-explanatory when you think of it like that. So if you hear that me, Dan, or in future somebody mention the term of an agreement, it's the duration, and that may include renewals. On the flip side of that, termination. You might think termination is a bit of a strong word for a contract, but of course that's obviously the end of an agreement, of a sponsorship agreement, or any commercial contract for that matter. And it might include different termination rights as well. So you're not just going to have one line on this agreement can be terminated with 6 months notice for convenience by either party. That's a termination for convenience clause. There'll be lots of different ways that either party can terminate a contract. Another term that, and it's confusing that we're saying what are the key terms and term with duration, which is why I wanted to clarify that. But another key term to mention might be parties. That's not that we're having a party because our favourite football team or whatever has got a new ground that we're really happy about after having one really old, hanging around in a legacy. Parties is the entities involved. So which company signs on behalf of the sponsor or the owner of the stadium. And there'll be different complications there. Commercials or the financials that go beyond a deal, and then maybe another key term that we can mention, but I know we've done a lot on this before, Dan. So also another encouragement for the audience to look back is IP, which is intellectual property. And that defines how each party can use each other's brand, logo, etc. So those are the ones that come to the top of mind for me in terms of, key things to talk about.
Nice. So as we move on to the intermediate level, we'll kind of have now that we've looked at the basics, we'll take a deeper dive into this. So if we're looking on the business and kind of the business process side of this, how do clubs or stadium owners go about finding a naming rights sponsor? And is there a bidding or negotiation process?
I would imagine so, Dan. I would imagine there would be bids involved, and businesses that are looking ahead and are hot on this, that are interested in being a sponsor or having one, will be thinking proactively about opportunities. So even when there's an announcement or a little inkling of something new being built, you would expect those that are keen to get some sort of sponsorship in the next 5 years in their business plan to be, oh, we're interested, we're going to wait for an announcement for a bidding process, or we're going to try and network and put ourselves forward and see if there's any opportunity to create some links, for example, and they'll be thinking about it that way. What I would imagine happens is it will be announced that, okay, let's use the Everton Stadium, for example. Yes, we are going to name this, because not all of them do. If you look at Old Trafford, there's lots of different stadiums that for legacy reasons might not have a name above it. My local team, I still call it the Britannia, even though it's not the Britannia Stadium anymore, it's the Bet365, but it's just because of the links that we've had to sponsorships. But I don't call it, the Stoke City FC Stadium, because we've had one, but there are lots of ones that decide not to. So you need to wait for that nod, is what I'm saying, from a stadium to say, formally, we are looking for somebody. And then they'll launch a bid process, and it's usually the procurement teams that are involved in that. So procurement, if you're not familiar with that department, I encourage you to have a look into it, because as a lawyer, you'll be working with them. And then interested companies will submit bids or enter into negotiations for what they think. So they might say, this is what we can give you. This is why you should choose us. This is how much it's going to cost you. This is how much we're looking for. And then, of course, a formal process is started and kicked off to try and find the right one.
So this is kind of going back to what we talked about in the beginning of the session. This is kind of how the naming right deals are bundled with like perks and hospitality and access kind of packages.
Yes, definitely.
So as we move on to that, what are some of the most important terms and risks in a typical naming rights contract?
If we link this to that list that I reeled off a few minutes ago, maybe that might be helpful, so we can create a synergy. If you think of the term of an agreement, so the duration, we've already introduced that. These deals are often for a long period of time, so 10 to 30 years. And there's a reason for that. It's because you don't want to change them too often, because it's confusing for the person that's attending. It's confusing for the marketing teams, and to build that synergy, you don't want it to look like something's happened. That means you've fallen out. You want it to be a long-term thing for lots of common sense reasons. And imagine how costly it would be to change the sponsor of something so huge if it's everywhere. But then with that comes risks and opportunities. If you think 10 to 30 years, how different are things going to be in that time?
Mm-hmm.
What is the performance of the team that are playing at the stadium, for example? I won't comment too much on Everton because my other half supports them, but they've been up and down recently, and have been a bit on the edge as to whether they're going to stay in the Prem. So you've got all those sorts of risks, and you think, well, what's that got to do with legal? Well, to answer Dan's question, the legal risk there is, if you've paid all of this money to sponsor a Premier League team, would you have paid that for a Championship side? What are you envisaging in the contract? And are there any mechanisms to change things? I don't know. So you've got to think about those things. So I think that's one of the first risks that I would flag, Dan, is the duration.
Yeah, because obviously, as you say, it's a long-term deal, so you need to ensure that everything's kind of covered to both parties' favours to make sure from this. As you say, if they're paying Premier League prices for a Championship club, they're probably not going to be too happy with that.
No.
So we've touched on it very briefly. We've touched on it very briefly today, but also other episodes. But why is exclusivity or intellectual property so important to these agreements?
Exclusivity is a big one as well, isn't it, that we could talk about? Because if you're not the only sponsor of something, again, it's a bit disjointed. And how does it really work? So you don't need to be a legal expert or a sports or naming rights, anything, to think about how confusing that would be. You could do with one name. But we do sometimes see teams that have, different names on their shirts than they would have at the stadium. So you've got to get it right too. But what it comes down to is the business's intentions. So if, as a lawyer, you get that wrong and it's not communicated correctly in the contract. So say, for example, you've got a strict instruction that we've got a sponsor for our stadium, and they are going to be the exclusive sponsor, and that's what the whole deal is based upon. It's really important to them. But in the contract, you don't reflect that, and you don't say this is exclusive. And I'm sure it'll be picked up. But if it's not watertight enough, or if there's a gap in that, then gosh, what a mistake to make. Because if you've had a strict instruction that that's the case, that's exactly where a lawyer should come in and make sure that what's on paper is what happens in reality. And you might think, well, isn't that just writing in a contract to say that they're the exclusive sponsor? It's not as simple as that. There's so much that will go into it, because exclusive for what? Exclusive for everything? Just the name above the stadium? Just the advertising stands? Just perhaps the shirts? Just the the adverts that come on TV at the start of half time and at the end of half time. It's really interesting, isn't it? So you've got to think about those things as well. So exclusivity is important. And then IP, you've got to make sure that you aren't abusing someone's IP and then the logos are being used in the right way.
And I think it's something that I think we'll transition to the advanced level because it'll be a nice transition point. So one of the key areas in this sort of thing is the written requirements when a sponsor is from a regulated or controversial sector. So, for example, it could be gambling, could be alcohol, could be fossil fuels. What kind of requirements go into that? And then following on from that, what sort of position would a company going in to sponsor a stadium have in the say of other sponsorship rights? So, for example, if someone's sponsoring a stadium, and then, for example, if the shirt's sponsored by an arms company, or I know it's an extreme example, but kind of how they balance those sort of things.
It's a good point, especially to talk about in advance, because the regulatory side of this is often overlooked. You might just think, oh, commercial agreement, contract, got to negotiate it. Yeah, it's going to take time. And you need to make sure you've got a decent commercial lawyer on there that knows what they're talking about. But you can't overlook the regulatory side of things. The very first one that comes to mind is the Advertising Standards Agency. You know, no matter how you're advertising, you need to make sure that it's in accordance with everything there, and think about all the different industries that Dan's mentioned with the high risk too as well. You've got to think about the ages. Is there any age limitations? Are there any restrictions around what time you can advertise? Because if you're going to choose a sponsor and you can only put this sponsor on TV after the watershed, for example, but your game kicks off at 7:45 p.m., what the lawyer should have advised that, you know, you've breached a regulatory issue that you can't get over, because you've got to make sure that that's covered and accounted for. So again, a legal responsibility to flag the regulatory risks. There's a lot of there's a lot of gambling that's linked heavily to sport, especially football and others, that it is fine to do, but just don't forget that there will be regulatory hoops and hurdles to get over with those things as well.
And I guess it's kind of both regulatory and like industry approval. So, for example, I know we talk about Everton Stadium, but maybe the FA or the Premier League, or they have kind of a say in what is and isn't allowed.
Yeah, you're right to mention that as well, because licensing too, if you think that you've got the governing bodies of the actual industry that the stadium is for, not only the regulatory bodies of the sponsor itself. So you've got both sides to manage, and then you can now kind of see why this gets quite complicated for a lawyer, because you've got to think about those too. So the FA or the Premier League, they might have certain licensing restrictions. You might have to run it by them. You might have to, depending on how the company is owned, you might have to do some sort of consultation with either the fans or the owners, depending on what is required from a corporate point of view. So you can see how this just grows very quickly from just being a commercial arrangement. And yeah, there's going to be a lot of focus on the contract and the money and whatever. But behind the headlines that you will see as somebody who's preparing for a career in law, you should be thinking about, oh, well, how's regulatory going to impact this, and what will the FA have to say about it? And depending on how interested you are, you don't need this for general commercial awareness, but you could have a quick research and go, oh, I did go the extra mile, and think, oh, well, what could be in a licensing agreement for the FA to award, or the Premier League, and different leagues, to see how that would impact things as well.
And kind of to round out this part, how do reputational concerns factor into these details?
Oh, God.
Into the deals.
Yeah, and reputationally, you would need to think about, is it worth accepting the money for a certain sponsor? There's been some backlashes too, and even though you might get those bids at the start of the process, like Dan mentioned, somebody might bid 150 mil, or someone might bid 100 mil, but the 150 is a lot more risky. You might go, oh, it's a lot of money, 50 mil. But is it really worth the reputational damage? That's another commercial aspect to think about. And you've also got the link as well between the industries. How well can you sell that? Is it going to be appealing? And then there's got to be some sort of story around it. I do think the next step, as we are in advanced, that I'm going to mention, is that link to liability in the contract too. Because once you establish the commercial deal and what goes into it, you might want to think about how that transcribes and translates into a commercial contract. So liability, you will very commonly see clauses protecting against reputational damage. Now, again, there'll be a lawyer negotiating that as to what cap, what level, what even is reputational damage. Are we even going to accept that within our contract? Again, these are all complicated things that you can think about. But if you're interested in insuring against reputational liability and making sure that the contract is strong in terms of that, it's something else to mention as well in an interview.
And I think with football as well, it's one of those where reputational damages could not only come from the company, but from fans and from different sectors. So there's so many different areas that the contract needs to cover in order to cover both parties.
Definitely.
As we carry on this, how do lawyers help clubs kind of future-proof these details? So, like, for example, if the team changes stadium or league.
Yeah, so a lot of these complexities that we spoke about are now coming together now, aren't they? So you think with the duration of the contract, do you really want to be locked in for 30 years without a right to get out of it for certain reasons? So a big thing that a lawyer can help with is those termination rights that I alluded to, that I can now go into a little bit more. So as Dan mentions, if a league changes, or for the positive or the negative, you might qualify for certain leagues that you weren't in before, or you might get you might be on track to win the FA Cup, for example, then that might attract an incentive in the contract because you're going to get a lot more games. Obviously, the further you get in these competitions, the more the advertising exposure for the sponsor. So if you think about things like that might follow through, a lawyer could advise on, well, do you want to try and build in a mechanism to say, well, this is the basic deal for the league games. Any other games over and above that with competitions, whatever, we can get an extra uplift. However, you've got to expect on the other side the negotiation from the sponsor to say, well, if you go down or if something happens, then we want some money back. So it's to and fro of negotiation with things like that, of future proofing. The termination rights that I'll go into, you could maybe have a termination if the club becomes insolvent. Unfortunately, we know that happens. Or if there's some really bad press about it, or God forbid, let's say one of the new stadiums has a construction issue. And let's not go down the really negative part, but let's say they can't play any games there anymore and they have to go, and do a deal with, I don't know, Everton would be lucky, but Wembley to play some games there instead because they've got nowhere else to play. I know they go and play at the old ground at Goodison, but and then you've not got this name all of a sudden all over. So it's thinking of things like that as well. So what happens there? And if Everton cannot play any games for their full season at the new stadium, then the sponsor, Hill Dickinson, are going to have something to say about that. So they might want a termination right. I don't know. We don't know. We've not been privy to those conversations in the room. So termination rights for insolvency, for lack of exposure, reputational damage. You might want just a simple right to say this is a long agreement. Let's agree after 5 years to get round a table and discuss whether we want to continue and on what terms. All different things like that you'd expect a lawyer to be raising and talking about. And you can see why it needs a good head on the lawyer's shoulder, because you're always being a project manager to your client as well. And that's without client demands. We don't know what the client's demands are. So you've got that to consider as well.
Yeah, there's so many different considerations. It's one of those deals that you definitely need to have your head screwed on for.
Yes, you do. We do.
So for those that are obviously going to follow on with this story over time and kind of the way that it pans out, what trends are you seeing in the way that clubs or sponsors approach these partnerships, especially around heritage or retaining part of a stadium's traditional name?
Yeah, so again, it's difficult, isn't it, when you're thinking about what we want to keep even after the contract's ended, because there's quite a trend now, or um, maybe not necessarily a new thing, but people are really into vintage shirts, for example. And if the club still wants to sell a vintage shirt and go back to, say, the 70s or the 80s with that sponsor on it as official merchandise, and they haven't got the rights to do that anymore, should that have been something the lawyer should have flagged? For example, if they still want to nod to their roots with the legacy, um, it's again future-proofing the contract. So even though we're getting quite complex into legal terms now, but even though the contract's terminated, you might want to have something that lives on to give some sort of license or rights post the post the event, or post having a different sponsor, or even changing stadiums, different things like that. That could be a trend. Fan engagement purposes, lots of, I mentioned earlier that even though my local team, Stoke, is the Bet365 stadium, we've still got a strong allegiance to it being the Brit and the Britannia. And, there's people that really like to reference it in that way. Now, I'm not saying that anyone's going to come, any of the individual fans, for not calling it that. But if you're thinking about commercializing it in future, what rights are there or should there be? And that necessarily might not have been a consideration earlier, but it definitely is becoming so now. And there's another trend, as you've asked, Dan, that I might mention that links to legal points is post-COVID, we're also seeing across all contracts, not just naming rights, but more flexible clauses for things that might happen as a result of force majeure instances. Force majeure, basically acts of God, but if anything prevents this from being out there, you might want to adjust payments in unforeseen circumstances. So it's building on from what we were saying just really, but that's the legal term for doing it. So a force majeure clause and staggered payments and things like that might be a trend that you could think about. And that, again, that is quite advanced because you're linking different modern world experiences to the law and how that would transcribe into a contract. But if you really do think about it and take some time when you're preparing for applications and interviews, you will get there, and they're all valid points to make.
Yeah, I think the COVID reference and how kind of things can suddenly stop has definitely changed the way that businesses are trying to interact, especially with their contracts, because obviously it's kind of a out of nowhere, nobody really planned for it kind of deal. Whereas now for contracts, especially for sports and the way that it affects kind of the sporting and advertising industry, yeah, these sort of clauses will definitely be popping up. As we talk about the 20, 30-year contracts, it's definitely better for them to ensure that they're covered for if such events were to happen again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just very, very quickly to add, because I know we need to wrap up, but you always think about the lawyer involvement at the start. You need a lawyer all the way through these things, really. The contract won't just be negotiated and signed. It will be reviewed and reopened again and questioned. So there's another point as well to think about with legal support services by law firms as well.
Well, thank you so much, Emma, for today, and thank you for everyone for joining today's Commercial Awareness Compass. So remember, being commercially aware isn't just about following the news. It's about understanding how these developments shape business decisions and legal strategies. Whether you're just starting or thinking like a commercial advisor, always ask, how does this impact clients and what can a law firm do to help? Join us next week to keep building your commercial awareness. And until then, prepare without the panic. Thank you.